The sun was barely rising over Logan Square when the screams shattered the morning quiet. Mrs. Peterson, sweeping her front steps, dropped her broom in shock. The noise was coming from the Collins house, that young couple who always seemed so happy. "Let me go, Brandon. For God's sake, let me go." My desperate cries echoed down the street like a sound that froze everyone's blood. Suddenly, the door burst open. Brandon, his eyes bloodshot and reeking of alcohol, dragged me by my long, beautiful brown hair. I was in my nightgown, fighting to break free, my bare feet scraping against the rough pavement. "Help! Someone help me, please!" I called through sobs, my words breaking with each syllable. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, stunned by the scene unfolding before their eyes. Mrs. Peterson crossed herself, murmuring, "Dear Lord, protect her," while other women gasped in horror. Brandon, blind with rage, threw me to the ground of our small front yard so hard the impact echoed down the street. My hair, long and wavy, spread like a fan across the dirt, those locks that were the envy and admiration of the whole neighborhood. "You're a slut," Brandon yelled, pulling scissors from his pocket. The metal gleamed menacingly in the morning sun. "You think I don't know what you do at that mansion? Nobody's gonna look at you anymore, you hear me? Nobody." I trembled like a leaf, trying to crawl away from him, my nails digging into the dirt. "No, Brandon, please. I just take care of Mrs. Pemberton. I swear on my mother's grave." But Brandon wasn't listening. With one grip, he held me against the ground, pulling my hair so hard I cried out in pain. With the other, he started cutting savagely. The locks fell around me like dead leaves while I sobbed uncontrollably. "My hair. No, please, Brandon, I'm begging you." The neighbors watched in horror, paralyzed by fear of Brandon's fury and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Mr. Garcia, the mechanic from the corner, stepped forward, his face a mask of outrage, but his wife stopped him, grabbing his arm tightly. "Don't get involved, Pedro," she spoke quietly, fear evident in her tone. "It's between husband and wife." "But," Mr. Garcia started, his eyes moving between me and his wife. "If you interfere, who knows what he'll do to us," she insisted. Mr. Garcia stepped back, guilt visible on his face as he looked down. Around him, other neighbors murmured among themselves, creating a chorus of excuses and fear. Should we call the police? What for? They never do anything. Better not get involved. Through my sobs and scattered hair, I saw how my last hope of help was fading. The silence of my neighbors was deafening, more painful even than the pulling at my scalp. In that moment, I understood I was truly alone, trapped not just by Brandon's grip, but by the indifference of those around me. When Brandon heard the sirens, he panicked. His eyes, once clouded with anger, now showed the fear of a cornered animal. He dropped the scissors, which fell to the ground with a metallic clang, and looked around, searching for an escape. He leaned over me, his hot, threatening breath in my ear. "I'm coming back, and when I do, you'll pay for this. Nobody's gonna want you like this. Nobody." A chill ran down my spine, my body paralyzed as if the threat had taken shape and was holding me with invisible claws. Terror froze my blood at the promise of more violence to come. Brandon stood up, and before running away, shouted for everyone to hear, "This isn't over." Then he disappeared through the neighborhood alleys like a rat fleeing from light, leaving behind a silence full of fear and guilt. "I'm going to make it," I murmured to myself, so low nobody else heard. "This won't destroy me. This humiliation, this terrible day, wouldn't be my end. It would be my beginning, a painful beginning, but a beginning nonetheless." And as I crossed the threshold of my house, supported by Mrs. Peterson, I felt I was taking my first steps toward a new life, a life where I, and only I, would have control. Everything had started like a fairy tale, one of those I read as a child, dreaming of my Prince Charming. Brandon came into my life like a whirlwind of passion and promises. dazzling me with his easy smile and deep eyes. I was a young nurse fresh out of school, captivated by this mechanic with strong palms and an apparently tender heart. The first months were a dream. Brandon treated me like a queen, showering me with attention and gifts. He told me my hair was like silk, that my eyes shone brighter than the stars. I believed I was the luckiest woman in the world. But little by little, like a shadow growing at sunset, things started to change. At first it were small details. A look of disgust when I came home late from work. A cutting comment about my uniform. I justified it, thinking it was stress from Brandon's job. Then came the jealousy. He started questioning every hour I spent away from home. Why did I talk so much to that doctor? Why did I smile at the patients? The control became more and more suffocating. The first hit came on a summer night, after a hospital party. Brandon, drunk and furious, accused me of flirting with a colleague. I was surprised and scared, trying to calm him down, but I only got a slap that left me stunned. The next day, he cried, asked for forgiveness, swore it would never happen again. I believed him with my broken but hopeful heart. But it happened again, and again. Each incident followed by broken promises and sobs that meant nothing anymore. Now, 3 months before the day that would change everything, I found myself trapped in a cycle of fear and false hopes. My job with Mrs. Pemberton had become my only refuge, an oasis of peace in the middle of my personal storm. I always arrived early at the Pemberton mansion in Lincoln Park. With my nurse uniform impeccable and my long hair loose, I entered my patient's luxurious room. "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton," I greeted with a radiant smile as I entered the elegant room. "How are you feeling today?" The gracious lady, an elegant 72-year-old woman, returned my smile from her chair by the window. Despite the rare neurological disease that afflicted her, her eyes shone with a spark of life and wisdom. "Ah, Amanda, my child, the day always gets better when you arrive," she replied, extending her fingers to take mine. "Come, sit with me for a moment. Tell me, how are things at home?" My face darkened for an instant, but I quickly recovered my smile. "Everything's fine. Brandon's been a little stressed lately with his work at the shop, but nothing to worry about." My patient frowned, noticing something I was trying to hide. "Dear one, I've known you for a long time. Those eyes of yours can't lie. What's really happening?" I sighed, looking down. "It's just that he's not very happy with my work schedule. Brandon says I spend too much time here, that I don't take care of the house like I should." "And the marks on your arm? Are they also from his stress?" the wise woman asked, her tone soft but firm. I instinctively pulled my uniform sleeve, trying to hide the bruises. "It was an accident. I hit myself on the closet door." "Amanda," she said, taking my palms in hers, "closets don't leave finger marks." When did all this start? With moisture in my eyes, I finally broke down and told her everything. The elderly woman listened with compassion, offering words of encouragement and support. "Listen, Amanda," she continued, her speech taking on a maternal quality. "Love shouldn't hurt. You are worth more than this. You have a gift for caring for others, a brilliant intelligence. Why don't you tell me more about that dream of yours to be a doctor?" My face lit up at the change of subject. "Oh, every day I'm more fascinated by medicine. Dr. Parker lent me a book on neurology last week. It's incredible how the human brain works." "There's that spark in your eyes." My patient smiled. "You should pursue that dream, Amanda. You'd be an excellent doctor." "Me? No, I couldn't." I shook my head. "I don't have the money to study medicine, and Brandon says I already earn enough as a nurse." "Since when does he decide what you can or can't do?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're young, intelligent, and capable. The world is at your feet, darling." My phone's buzz interrupted our conversation. It was a message from Brandon. "Where are you? You're late again. You better not be with that little doctor." A knot formed in my stomach. "I'm sorry. I have to go. He's waiting for me for dinner." She nodded, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Go, sweetheart, but remember what I told you. And if you ever need help, anything at all, I'm here for you." On the way home, I passed by the University of Chicago. For a moment, I allowed myself to dream of walking through those halls, with a white coat and a stethoscope around my neck. But then I remembered the reality waiting for me at home and quickened my pace. The echo of police sirens still rang in the street when I realized Brandon had fled. The neighbors, who moments before watched paralyzed, now approached with a mix of shame and concern on their faces. Mrs. Peterson was the first to reach my side, wrapping me in a protective embrace. "It's over now, honey. You're safe now." But I knew it wasn't true. He had escaped, and his last words echoed in my mind like a threat. "This isn't over." When the police arrived, they found a chaotic scene. A young woman with brutally cut hair, surrounded by neighbors who now seemed willing to talk. The officers took statements while paramedics attended to me, cleaning my wounds and evaluating my condition. "Ma'am, we need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint," one of the policemen said, his speech gentle but firm. "It's important we document everything that happened so we can find your husband." I nodded weakly, still in shock from what had occurred. While they accompanied me to the patrol car, I looked back at the hair scattered across the yard. It was as if I had left behind not just my locks, but also a part of myself. At the police station, hours passed like a blur. Questions, forms, photographs of my wounds. I mechanically recounted the events, my mind still trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. "We'll do everything possible to find him," the officer in charge assured me. "Meanwhile, do you have somewhere safe to stay?" I thought about my patient, about the mansion in Lincoln Park, but fear of putting the gracious lady in danger made me hesitate. I don't know," I replied with a trembling tone. "We have shelters for women in your situation," the officer offered. "You'd be protected there while we resolve this." After what seemed like an eternity, I found myself back in my small apartment, accompanied by a patrol that would watch the entrance that night. They had advised me to pack some belongings and move to a safe place the next day. It was then, in the solitude of my bathroom, that I finally faced my reflection. The bathroom mirror reflected an image I didn't recognize. My eyes, swollen and red, stared at the disaster Brandon had made of my hair. Uneven strands fell over my gaunt face, while in some parts of my head the skin was exposed, brutally shaved. How could he do this to me? I spoke softly through sobs, gently touching the areas where my scalp was exposed. Weeping rolled down my cheeks uncontrollably, mixing with the hair strands that still covered the sink. My phone's sound startled me. It was another message from Mrs. Pemberton. "Sweetheart, I'm very worried. Why haven't you come? Are you okay? Please, answer." I looked at the message, my heart tight with shame and fear. I hadn't had the courage to go to work, to face the outside world. Just the thought of the stares, the whispers, the questions. It was too much to bear. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. With trembling fingers, I looked for a colorful scarf I used to wear on summer days. I tied it around my head, covering as best I could the disaster he had made. When I left my apartment, the world seemed to have stopped. Every step I took down Lincoln Avenue stretched like an eternity. The stares of my neighbors followed me, some of pity, others of morbid curiosity. Poor thing. She was so pretty. I heard Mrs. Peterson's murmur to another neighbor as I passed. A group of children playing on the sidewalk stared at me open-mouthed. One of them, the smallest, dared to ask, "Miss Amanda, why are you bald?" Moisture threatened to return to my eyes, but I managed to give him a weak smile. It's a new fashion, sweetie. Soon everyone will want to copy it." Every step toward the mansion was a battle against the desire to turn around and hide. But something inside me, a spark of the Amanda I used to be, pushed me forward. When I finally reached the mansion door, I collapsed. The sobs I had held back during the entire walk flowed uncontrollably. My patient, who was waiting for me anxiously, received me with a maternal embrace. "Dear one, my poor darling," the wise woman murmured, guiding me toward the mansion's interior. Once seated on the comfortable living room sofa, I managed to say between cries, "I'll never smile again. How will I ever look someone in the face again?" She took my face in her palms, looking directly into my eyes. "Listen to me well, sweetheart. Hair grows, but the soul needs to heal first. And you, my brave girl, have a beautiful soul that deserves to shine." The gracious lady got up slowly and went to an old desk. From one of the drawers, she took out a framed photograph and handed it to me. In the image, a beautiful young woman smiled at the camera, her long black hair falling in cascades over her shoulders. "That's me, many years ago," she explained. "Shortly after that photo was taken, I got seriously ill. The treatment made me lose all my hair." I looked at the photo and then at her, surprised. "But how did you overcome it?" "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "There were days when, like you now, I thought I would never smile again. But I learned a very important lesson. True beauty is in the eyes of someone who learned to love themselves." My patient sat next to me and began to gently untie the scarf that covered my head. "Now, my child, let's see what we can do with this beautiful hair of yours." With care and patience, she began to comb and arrange what was left of my locks. While she did it, she told me stories of her own life, of how she had faced adversities and come out ahead. "Look," she said finally, holding a mirror in front of me. "Do you see? You're still beautiful." I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair, although short and irregular, had been arranged with so much love that it almost seemed like an intentional style. But beyond my hair, I saw something in my eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "Thank you," I said softly, hugging the wise woman. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "What you'll do," she replied with a smile, "is move forward, because you're strong, you're brave, and you deserve a life full of love and respect." She made a promise. "Better days will come, darling, and I'll be here to help you receive them with your head held high." The Cook County Courthouse stood imposing before me, its stone columns casting threatening shadows over me on this cold autumn morning. With each step I took toward the entrance, my heart beat harder, threatening to burst from my chest. My patient, by my side, gently squeezed my palm in support, her presence an anchor in the middle of the emotional storm I was going through. "Stay calm, dear one," she spoke quietly, her words a balm for my nerves. "I'm here with you. Remember, you're stronger than you think." When we entered the courtroom, the air escaped from my lungs. The atmosphere was suffocating, charged with tension and expectation. And there, sitting on the other side of the room, was Brandon. Our eyes met for an instant. His gaze, which once looked at me with love, now only showed cold indifference mixed with something that seemed like resentment. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up. I sat down, my fingers trembling slightly as I nervously smoothed my skirt. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with compassionate eyes, began presenting the case. His speech echoed in the room as he detailed the night of the assault and the years of abuse I had suffered in silence. When it was time to testify, my legs turned to jelly. I approached the witness stand, aware of all the eyes on me. My hair, although it had grown a little, still showed the marks of that terrible night, a constant reminder of what I had endured. Mrs. Collins, the prosecutor began, his tone gentle but firm. Can you tell us what happened on the night of July 15th? I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment to gather strength. When I opened them, my gaze met that of the gracious lady, who offered me an encouraging smile. With that borrowed strength, I began to speak. My words, trembling at first, gained power with each sentence. It was a night like any other, I began. I had come home late from work, taking care of Mrs. Pemberton. Brandon, my husband, was drinking. He started yelling at me, accusing me of flirting with the gardener and driver. I described the terror of that night, the humiliations I had endured for years, the constant fear I lived in. My speech broke when I reached the most painful part. He took the scissors and started cutting my hair, I said, moisture running down my cheeks. I begged him to stop. I swore I hadn't cheated on him, but he just kept yelling and cutting. It was like he was tearing away a part of myself. From his seat, Brandon looked at me with a mix of contempt and something that seemed almost like regret. But when his lawyer stood up to cross-examine, all compassion disappeared from his face. Mrs. Collins, the defense attorney began, his words loaded with false sympathy. Isn't it true that you constantly provoked my client with your behavior? My blood froze in my veins. For a moment, the old fear threatened to drown me. But then, I remembered the wise woman's words, "You're stronger than you think." With that newfound strength, I responded firmly, "No, I only did my job and tried to be a good wife. I never did anything to provoke his anger or jealousy." And didn't that job include spending a lot of time with the young gardener or the attractive driver at the mansion? The lawyer insisted, his tone insinuating. "Objection," the prosecutor shouted, jumping up. "Speculative and irrelevant." "Sustained," the judge responded, his speech severe. "Counselor, limit yourself to the facts of the case." The interrogation continued, each question like a dagger that revived old wounds. But with each answer, I sensed a new strength growing inside me. I was no longer the scared woman who hid from the blows. I was a survivor, and I was determined that justice be done. When the judge called for recess, I came out of the courtroom stumbling. My patient was waiting for me outside, enveloping me in a protective embrace that smelled of lavender and security. "You're doing very well, my brave one," she murmured, gently stroking my hair. "Soon it will all be over. I'm so proud of you." The trial extended for days that seemed eternal. Witnesses came and went. Police officers described the scene they found that night. Neighbors recounted the screams they had heard for years. Even the gracious lady testified about my emotional state in the months prior to the incident. Finally, the time came for the closing arguments. The prosecutor stood up, his presence filling the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his words resonating with conviction. "And we have heard the brave testimony of a woman who has endured years of abuse and terror. We have seen the scars, both physical and emotional, that the defendant has left on her. This is not just about one night of violence, but about a systematic pattern of control and abuse. I ask you to do justice, to send a clear message. This type of violence will not be tolerated in our society." Brandon's lawyer, for his part, tried to minimize the facts, talking about misunderstandings and passionate outbursts. But his argument sounded hollow against the evidence presented. When the jury retired to deliberate, time seemed to stop. Every minute that passed was agony. What if they didn't believe me? What if Brandon went free? After what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The room fell into complete silence as the spokesperson stood up. I held my breath, my grip tight on the wise woman's palm. This jury finds the defendant guilty on all charges. A murmur ran through the room. An enormous weight lifted from my shoulders. Relief flowed down my cheeks while my patient hugged me tightly, speaking words of comfort and joy. Brandon, for his part, remained impassive as the judge dictated the sentence. 8 years in prison. Only when the officers took him away did he look at me one last time. For a moment, I saw a flash of the man I had fallen in love with, now lost under layers of anger and resentment. That brief moment of connection left me with a confusing mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. When leaving the courthouse, everything felt strangely light, but also confusing. My entire adult life had revolved around Brandon. The freedom I had longed for so much now stretched before me, vast and a little frightening. "And now what?" I asked, my speech barely audible, mixed with fear and hope. The gracious lady smiled at me with affection, her eyes shining with wisdom. "Now, sweetheart, your real life begins. A life where you decide, where you are the owner of your destiny. The road won't be easy, but I'll be with you every step of the way." I nodded, sensing a mix of fear and excitement about the unknown. One step at a time, I told myself, breathing deeply the fresh air. One day at a time. The Amanda who left the courthouse that day wasn't the same one who had entered. She was stronger, braver, and ready to write the next chapter of her life with her own hands. Have you ever been in a similar situation? How would you have reacted? Tell us your opinion in the comments. 3 months after the trial, I stood in Mrs. Pemberton's magnificent garden, watching autumn sunlight filter through ancient oak leaves that painted golden shadows across her delicate form. Her hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now shook violently as she struggled with silver pruning shears that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The progressive neurological disease was claiming her body piece by piece, but her brilliant mind remained sharp as surgical steel. The garden around us burst with late-blooming flowers, crimson roses, purple asters, golden marigolds that released their earthy perfume into the crisp morning air. I hurried across the perfectly manicured lawn, my feet sinking into grass so lush it felt like walking on emerald velvet. When I gently extracted the tools from her grip, I felt how her bones had become as fragile as bird wings. Mrs. Pemberton settled into her ornate wicker chair positioned to catch the morning sun, streaming through overhead branches. Her eyes, still brilliant blue despite her failing health, studied my face with that penetrating intensity I'd grown to cherish. The cashmere blanket draped across her lap shifted as she adjusted her position, and I noticed how the elegant fabric seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. "I've been contemplating your future, dear one. You cannot spend your precious years merely tending to one deteriorating old woman." I positioned myself at her feet, looking directly into those wise eyes that had seen 8 decades of triumph and heartbreak. "You literally saved my existence when I had nothing left." Her voice carried that familiar authority I'd learned meant business. "Tell me truthfully, when you devour those medical journals until dawn breaks, what ignites within your soul?" The question stirred something deep in my chest. How could I articulate the electrical storm that erupted when I read about breakthrough surgical techniques? The way my pulse quickened when I studied brain anatomy diagrams. The overwhelming hunger to understand how neurons fired and healed and rewired themselves. My voice barely rose above the morning breeze rustling through rose bushes. I feel alive, like there's this vast universe of medical knowledge calling to me. Yesterday, I discovered an article about revolutionary brain surgery procedures, and I stayed awake until 4 a.m. with my mind racing, imagining how those techniques could help people everyone else considers hopeless cases. Mrs. Pemberton's entire face illuminated with pure joy, her smile transforming her aged features into something radiant and beautiful. She reached into her designer handbag with unsteady hands and withdrew a thick manila envelope that felt warm from her touch. I stared at it like it contained live dynamite, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm financing your entire pre-medical education. Every textbook, every laboratory fee, every ounce of tuition required." Tears cascaded down my cheeks without warning, hot and salty and unstoppable. My hands quivered as I accepted the envelope that represented my entire future, wrapped in cream-colored paper. But what if I collapse under academic pressure? What if I prove intellectually inadequate for such demanding studies? Mrs. Pemberton reached out with unsteady fingers and cupped my face, her palms soft as rose petals against my skin. "Darling girl, you've already conquered the impossible. You faced your worst nightmare and emerged victorious." That afternoon found me clutching application forms in the University of Chicago admissions office, my palms slick with nervous perspiration. The receptionist, a motherly woman named Susan with silver hair swept into an elegant bun, immediately noticed my agitation. When I explained my situation, attempting life reinvention at 28, her hearty laughter filled the cramped office like music. Something about her authentic interest unlocked my carefully guarded story. Words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, Brandon's escalating abuse, the hair-cutting humiliation that nearly broke me, Mrs. Pemberton's intervention that saved my sanity, my newfound hunger for medical knowledge that consumed my thoughts. Susan absorbed every word without judgment, occasionally nodding with understanding that made my chest tight with gratitude. Medical school admissions committees treasure narratives like yours. You're not another privileged student seeking prestige. You're someone who's experienced real suffering, genuine survival, authentic transformation. 2 weeks later, Dr. Andrew Parker arrived for Mrs. Pemberton's routine neurological assessment, his presence bringing subtle energy that shifted the mansion's atmosphere. The advanced neurology textbook prominently displayed on the antique coffee table seemed to catch his attention immediately. His dark eyes lit up like a child discovering treasure when I explained my pre-medical aspirations. "I'm currently directing groundbreaking research on brain trauma rehabilitation at Northwestern. Your nursing background combined with personal insight into recovery processes could prove invaluable." As we discussed his research methodology over the following hour, I discovered myself utterly captivated. Dr. Parker possessed this gift for translating complex neurological concepts into accessible language, never condescending despite my obvious inexperience. After I posed several sophisticated questions about neuroplasticity and synaptic healing, he declared with unwavering certainty that made my heart skip beats, "You will succeed in medical school." 3 months into my pre-medical coursework, existence finally felt purposeful. Chicago's winter had arrived with vengeance, coating the city in pristine snow that transformed familiar streets into something magical. I excelled in every subject, contributed meaningfully to Dr. Parker's research, and possessed genuine direction. Then Maria, Mrs. Pemberton's devoted housekeeper, telephoned at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, her voice shaking with panic that immediately sent ice through my veins. Mrs. Pemberton had collapsed during dinner. The ambulance had departed for Northwestern Memorial. She kept asking for me. I raced through empty Chicago streets, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt harsh and sterile after the warm glow of Mrs. Pemberton's mansion. Dr. Parker waited in the emergency department, his usually composed face etched with deep concern that made my stomach plummet. The disease had accelerated far beyond their most pessimistic projections. Her neurological function was deteriorating rapidly. She had very limited time remaining. I discovered Mrs. Pemberton in a private room that smelled of antiseptic and approaching death. She appeared impossibly fragile in the sterile hospital bed, her once commanding presence reduced to a whisper of its former strength. But when she spotted me, Her eyes retained that familiar warmth and unbreakable spirit that had carried her through 8 decades of living. "And there's my future physician," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with pride that made my throat close with emotion. I grasped her hand gently, feeling how thin her skin had become, like tissue paper over delicate bones. The monitors around her bed beeped steadily, marking time in a rhythm that felt both comforting and ominous. "Promise you'll finish what we've begun together. Promise you'll become the doctor I know lives within you." Tears flowed freely now, hot and unstoppable. "I promise with my entire being." Mrs. Pemberton smiled with peaceful contentment. "You know, I never bore children of my own. Always wondered what maternal love felt like. But if I could have had a daughter, I would have prayed for her to be exactly like you." Those words became her final meaningful gift to me, Mrs. Pemberton passed away 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, while I held her hand and whispered gratitude for everything she'd given me. At her funeral, her attorney pulled me aside with stunning news. She'd bequeathed sufficient funds for my entire medical education, including residency expenses. Standing at her graveside that gray October afternoon, watching them lower the casket containing my savior, I made a solemn vow that echoed across the cemetery. The University of Chicago campus pulsed with autumn energy as I navigated between towering Gothic buildings. My backpack weighted with textbooks that represented unlimited possibilities. 10 months had passed since Mrs. Pemberton's death, and I was finally thriving as a pre-medical student, though the journey toward emotional healing remained delicately complex. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I moved through icy sidewalks where other students pursued their own dreams. The bitter Chicago wind whipped through my coat, but I barely noticed the cold. My mind buzzed with organic chemistry formulas and anatomical diagrams that danced through my thoughts like beautiful puzzles waiting to be solved. Jake Morrison, my biochemistry study partner, had become one of my closest friends through countless late-night study marathons, fueled by coffee and shared determination. Despite being 6 years younger, his ability to explain molecular structures had saved my academic life. Our study sessions often stretched past midnight in the library's quiet corners, surrounded by towering stacks of medical textbooks that smelled of knowledge and possibility. But transformation hadn't been smooth, and emotional scars required as much attention as academic achievement. Dr. Sarah Chen's office felt like a warm cocoon compared to the harsh winter outside. Soft lighting, green plants in every corner, comfortable chairs that invited vulnerable honesty. The sound of traffic hummed distantly through thick windows, while a small fountain bubbled peacefully in the corner. After missing 3 consecutive appointments, I finally faced her patient but unmistakable concern. My hand still bore faint scars from that terrible night with Brandon, as I fidgeted nervously, making excuses about study groups and lectures and research projects that demanded my attention. When Dr. Chen asked what I was running from, the question struck like a physical blow to my solar plexus, stealing breath from my lungs. The office's warmth suddenly felt suffocating. Around us, the afternoon light filtering through windows seemed to dim as I struggled to articulate why examining the past felt so dangerous. Dr. Chen spoke truth when she explained that unprocessed pain doesn't magically disappear. It gets buried deeper, influencing everything despite our belief that we've moved beyond it. Deep in my bones, I knew she was right. Despite my academic success and growing confidence, I still jumped like a startled animal when doors slammed unexpectedly. My body still went rigid with panic when someone touched me without warning, and I definitely couldn't imagine trusting anyone enough for romantic intimacy. When she asked me to describe a moment of safety, I closed my eyes and searched my memories like sorting through photographs. Mrs. Pemberton's garden materialized in my mind. That perfect spring morning surrounded by blooming roses that smelled like heaven, listening to stories about her adventures in 1960s Paris. The sunshine had warmed my face, while everything smelled like flowers and infinite possibility, creating a moment when no harm could reach me. She truly saw me, I understood aloud. Not as a victim, not as someone damaged and broken. She saw my intelligence, my potential, who I could become. The revelation crystallized something important about my healing process. Genuine strength wasn't about never falling apart. It was about reassembling yourself every single time you did. My MCAT scores arrived on a dreary, rain-soaked Thursday in March, when Chicago felt particularly unforgiving. I sat in my small apartment with steam rising from my coffee mug, staring at the email in my inbox for several minutes before summoning courage to open it. My heart hammered so violently I could hear it echoing in my ears like thunder. The numbers displayed on my computer screen seemed impossible, top 5% nationally. Through my window, rain pelted against glass while inside, my future suddenly felt bright and possible. Doctor. Parker's excited phone call confirmed what I could barely believe. These scores would open doors I'd never dared imagine. During my University of Chicago interview, I sat across from Dr. Elizabeth Murphy in her imposing office lined with medical textbooks and diplomas that spoke of decades dedicated to healing. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny possibilities. When she asked why I wanted to specialize in neurology, my voice grew stronger with each word. Because the brain houses everything that makes us fundamentally human. Our memories, our personalities, our capacity for love and hope and healing. When someone suffers brain injury or disease, we're not merely treating an organ, we're helping restore their essential humanity. My nursing experience had taught me that medicine transcended accurate diagnosis and effective treatment protocols. It was about recognizing the whole human being behind the symptoms. The terrified mother whose child wouldn't awaken after an accident. The elderly gentleman who couldn't remember his beloved wife's name. The teenager whose seizures had stolen her independence and dreams. 3 weeks later, the acceptance letter materialized in my mailbox like a miracle wrapped in university letterhead. I called Nicole immediately, sobbing so intensely I could barely form coherent words. Her shriek of joy was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, but her excitement matched my own overwhelming relief and happiness. That evening, I drove through Chicago's twilight to Graceland Cemetery, where ancient trees stood sentinel over generations of dreams fulfilled and deferred. I placed fresh white roses on Mrs. Pemberton's headstone and sat cross-legged in the grass beside her, feeling her presence like warmth despite the evening chill. The words I whispered to the gathering darkness carried all my gratitude and determination. I did it. I'm going to be a doctor. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. 4 years later, I stood in the pristine corridors of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, my hard-earned medical degree finally in hand, and my neurology residency about to commence. The morning sun streamed through towering windows, casting long shadows across marble floors that had witnessed countless medical miracles. The hospital's symphony surrounded me, the smell of antiseptic mixed with coffee from the nearby cafeteria, the constant hum of activity with rolling gurneys, beeping monitors, and hushed conversations between medical staff, creating a rhythm of healing that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief resident, approached with confident strides, her white coat crisp, and her presence commanding immediate respect. Though only a year my senior, her expertise and natural leadership were immediately obvious. She explained that Dr. Marcus Harrison, a legend in neurosurgery renowned internationally for accepting the most challenging and seemingly impossible cases, had personally requested me for his elite surgical team. My inaugural case involved Tom Rodriguez, a 45-year-old construction worker whose life had changed in an instant when he plummeted 3 stories from scaffolding onto unforgiving concrete. The resulting traumatic brain injury had stolen his ability to speak coherently or recognize his own family members. His wife of 20 years had become a stranger, his children's faces blank mysteries. In the consultation room dominated by large monitors displaying Tom's MRI images, I studied the scans meticulously. My nursing background helped me see beyond mere technical data to the human story they told. The damaged areas glowed white against gray matter, mapping a tragedy in neural pathways. I could see extensive damage to Broca's area affecting speech production, but surrounding tissue demonstrated significant potential for neuroplasticity. Dr. Harrison nodded with obvious approval when I recommended immediate surgical intervention followed by intensive therapy. His eyes lit up with the same passion that had driven him through decades of pushing medical boundaries. The next morning, I would assist in surgery that could potentially restore substantial function if we acted swiftly and aggressively. 6 months into my residency, everything changed with one phone call that would alter my trajectory forever. The residence lounge felt particularly quiet that evening, most of my colleagues having gone home to families and lives outside these walls. I was reviewing patient files when my phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the peaceful silence. The caller ID displayed a Chicago number I didn't recognize, but something about it made my stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. Detective Rodriguez's voice carried news that transformed my blood to ice water coursing through my veins. Brandon had been diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor. Very advanced case. He was specifically asking for me to be his attending physician. The entire universe seemed to halt its rotation around me. Through the lounge windows, Baltimore's evening lights blurred as my vision tunneled. The detective's words echoed in the sudden silence. Brandon claimed he had no other family members. His case had been transferred to Chicago General Hospital, and they desperately needed a specialist with my particular training and experience. After managing to end the call, I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, watching shadows lengthen across the empty lounge. Brandon had a brain tumor. The man who had almost destroyed my entire existence, who had cut my hair in a public display of dominance and abuse, was now asking me to save his life. When I called Dr. Harrison to explain the situation, his thoughtful response revealed the depth of his wisdom gained through 30 years of medical practice. Medicine isn't just about technical skill and scientific knowledge. It's fundamentally about character and moral integrity. The fact that you're even considering taking this case, given your personal history with this man, says everything about who you are as both a physician and a human being. That night, I walked through Baltimore's scenic Inner Harbor district, where water lapped gently against wooden docks and city lights reflected like fallen stars on the dark surface. The air smelled of salt and possibility, while couples strolled hand in hand along pathways I navigated alone, thinking about everything that had brought me to this pivotal moment. Mrs. Pemberton's words echoed in my mind like a prayer. True strength isn't about never falling apart, my dear. It's about putting yourself back together every single time you do. I thought about Tom, the construction worker whose life I had helped save and who was now speaking in sentences again. About the dozens of other patients I had treated and helped heal over the past months. About the terrified, broken woman I used to be, and the confident, skilled physician I had worked so hard to become. By the time I returned to my modest apartment, watching Baltimore's skyline settle into nighttime quiet, I had made my decision. The woman I had become was strong enough to face the man who had nearly destroyed the woman I used to be. The next morning, I called Detective Rodriguez with steady conviction that surprised even me. I would take the case, but with very specific conditions. Strictly professional medical care with no personal contact beyond what was medically necessary. As I hung up the phone, something fundamental had shifted deep within me. I wasn't the same frightened woman who had fled Chicago 5 years ago with nothing but trauma and shattered dreams. I was Dr. Amanda Collins, neurosurgeon, and I was finally ready to face my past on my own terms. The flight from Baltimore to Chicago felt like journeying through time itself. The airplane ascending through clouds that obscured the past and descended toward a city that held both my worst nightmares and greatest triumphs. As we approached O'Hare, autumn's colors painted the landscape below in shades of gold and crimson, while Lake Michigan stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Nicole met me at the gate, her familiar face showing complex emotions that immediately transported me back to our nursing school days. Her embrace smelled of lavender perfume and carried the comfort of unconditional friendship. She explained Brandon's condition during our drive through Chicago's familiar streets. The tumor was affecting his speech patterns, motor functions, even his personality. We drove in contemplative silence while the city unfolded around us. The neighborhoods where I'd once lived in fear now looked different, smaller somehow, less threatening. When we reached Chicago General Hospital, its imposing brick facade rising against gray October sky, I felt my heart rate accelerate, but it wasn't the paralyzing terror I'd expected. Instead, it was anticipation mixed with professional determination. Dr. James Kim, a young resident with his white coat still crisp with newness, met us at the main entrance. His explanation of Brandon's condition was clinically precise. Glioblastoma multiforme, stage 4, extremely aggressive, spread extensively throughout the right temporal lobe. The local neurosurgery team had deemed it inoperable, but given my reputation for handling complex cases that others considered hopeless, they held on to slim hope. Walking down the long corridor toward room 4B, fluorescent lights hummed overhead while nurses moved efficiently between rooms. Through the small window in the door, I could see a figure lying motionless in the hospital bed. Even from behind, even with his head partially shaved from recent biopsy procedures, I recognized Brandon immediately. Time seemed to slow as memories flooded back. His hands in my hair, the sound of scissors cutting, the weight of humiliation and helplessness. I took one deep, steadying breath that filled my lungs with sterile hospital air, knocked once on the door, and entered the room. The space smelled of antiseptic and approaching mortality. Machines beeping steadily in rhythm with a life hanging in delicate balance. Good afternoon, Mr. Collins. I'm Dr. Amanda Collins, your neurological consultant. Brandon turned his head slowly toward my voice, movement obviously painful and labored. When our eyes met, recognition was immediate and unmistakable. But his reaction wasn't what I had expected. Instead of anger or defensiveness or the manipulative charm I remembered, his eyes brimmed with tears that spilled over pale cheeks. His whispered words were slurred from the tumor's effects. Amanda, you actually came. I maintained careful emotional distance while setting my medical bag on the bedside table. I'm here in my professional capacity as your physician. Moving to his bedside, I began conducting my standard neurological examination, my hands steady as I checked reflexes, pupil response, and cognitive function. His hand tremor was pronounced, and he struggled to follow even simple commands like squeezing my fingers or tracking a penlight with his eyes. The assessment took over an hour, during which I documented everything with clinical precision that felt like armor protecting me from emotional overwhelm. The MRI images on my tablet showed the tumor as an ominous white mass disrupting normal brain architecture. The tumor has grown extensively into areas controlling speech, movement, and memory formation. Any surgical intervention would be extremely high risk, with significant potential for complications. Outside his window, Chicago's skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan, while inside, two people who'd shared a terrible history confronted mortality together. When he asked if he was going to die, the question hung heavy in the antiseptic air between us. Without surgical intervention, the prognosis is quite poor. Perhaps 6 months, possibly less depending on the tumor's growth rate. With surgery, there would be a chance for meaningful recovery, a small chance, but a real one. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, tears continuing to track down his cheeks. Then, with obvious effort, he began speaking words I never thought I'd hear. A profound apology for everything he'd done, spent every day of 8 years regretting his actions, wishing he could undo every horrible thing. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room overlooking the Chicago River, watching boats navigate dark water while city lights reflected like scattered diamonds on the surface. Dr. Parker's phone call bridged the distance between past and present, his voice offering the reassurance I needed to face what lay ahead. The operating room the next morning felt like a cathedral of healing, powerful surgical lights illuminating the space where miracles and tragedies played out in equal measure. Working with a team of nurses and technicians, I carefully navigated Brandon's brain tissue with instruments that felt like extensions of my will. The surgery lasted 12 grueling hours that tested every skill I'd developed over years of training. But as I worked, removing cancerous tissue millimeter by millimeter while preserving essential functions, something happened inside me. All the residual fear, all the buried anger, all the lingering trauma seemed to dissolve. There was only the surgery, only the sacred work of healing that transcended personal history and focused purely on the fundamental human obligation to preserve life. Tumor removal appears successful. All major neurological functions appear intact. 3 days later, Brandon was awake and responsive, his speech significantly clearer, and hand tremor almost gone. When I entered his room for the final post-operative evaluation, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, genuine, profound gratitude mixed with something that might have been wonder. "You saved my life." Standing at the foot of his hospital bed, afternoon sunlight streaming through his window, I felt nothing but peace. "What you choose to do with that second chance is up to you, Brandon. But I want you to know something important. I forgive you." His eyes widened in shock at words he never expected to hear. My explanation was simple. Forgiveness wasn't about him deserving it, but about me deserving freedom from the anger and resentment I'd been carrying. Forgiveness was about choosing to release the past so I could embrace my future. As I left his room for the final time, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was still carrying. In the hallway, Dr. Parker waited for me, his presence like coming home. When he asked how I felt, my answer came without hesitation: free. 6 months later, I stood in the beautiful garden where Mrs. Pemberton and I had shared so many meaningful conversations. The new owners had lovingly maintained her rose garden exactly as she would have wanted, with blooms in every color, painting the landscape like living art. Dr. Parker stood beside me, and somewhere along our professional relationship, he had quietly become the man I loved deeply. Looking back on my journey from broken victim to accomplished healer, I understood that sometimes the very worst things that happen to us end up leading us exactly where we need to be. I was Dr. Amanda Collins, neurosurgeon, healer, survivor, and finally, truly happy. The best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was living fully. It was becoming everything I was meant to be. If this story touched your heart, like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Share with someone who needs to hear that no matter how dark things get, there's always hope for tomorrow. What would you have done in my situation? Tell us in the comments.